Racist cop pulls over black judge. What happens next shocks everyone. The blue and red lights flashed in the rearview mirror, piercing through the darkness of the quiet suburban road. Angela Carter sighed, her fingers tightening slightly around the leather steering wheel of her black Mercedes. She had seen those lights before, too many times. But this time, she hadn't been speeding. She hadn't run a stop sign. There was no justifiable reason for the police car behind her to initiate a stop. And yet, here she was, pulling over to the side of the road like a law-abiding citizen, because she knew how these encounters could go. Before I go on, I know you are enjoying the story, so I would really appreciate it if you give this video a like, smash the subscribe button down below, and turn on the bell notification to get notified whenever I drop a new video. Alright, let's continue. As she slowed to a stop, she took a deep breath and reached for her purse, pulling out her license and registration. Experience had taught her that preparation could mean the difference between a minor inconvenience and an unnecessary escalation. She adjusted her rearview mirror, getting a glimpse of the officer stepping out of his cruiser. He moved with the kind of authority that suggested he thought he was about to put someone in their place. She'd seen it before, cops who mistook their badge for a crown, who assumed control without question, without cause. The officer approached with an air of arrogance, his hand resting on his holster as if expecting trouble. He was white, mid-40s, with a buzz cut and a thick build. His face was hard, his expression unreadable. But Angela knew what was coming. She rolled down the window, keeping her hands visible, the way she had advised her nephews to do if they ever found themselves in this situation. The way black parents had to teach their children just in case. License and registration. The officer barked, not even bothering with a greeting. Angela handed them over without a word. He barely glanced at the documents before shifting his focus back to her. Do you know why I pulled you over? She met his gaze calmly. No, officer. Why did you? He smirked, tapping his fingers against the roof of her car. This is a nice vehicle. Doesn't really seem like yours. There it was. Angela kept her expression neutral. I assure you it is. The officer glanced at the license again, then back at her. Angela Carter, he read aloud, his tone laced with disbelief. What do you do for a living? Angela tilted her head slightly, studying him. Is that relevant to this traffic stop? His smirk widened. Just making conversation. Where are you coming from? Work. And where is that? Angela took a slow breath. She could see where this was going. He was fishing, waiting for a response that didn't fit his expectations. If she said she worked in law enforcement, he'd assume she was lying. If she said she was a judge, which she was, he'd either refuse to believe her or get defensive. Neither option boded well. The officer tapped his fingers again, this time against her window frame. Go ahead and step out of the vehicle for me. Angela didn't move. On what grounds? Suspicious behavior. She raised an eyebrow. Suspicious how? His smirk faltered for a brief second, but he recovered quickly. I asked you a simple question, and you're refusing to answer. That makes me think you have something to hide. Angela's patience thinned. Officer. She squinted at his badge. Reynolds, you have my identification. You have my vehicle registration. If I have committed a traffic violation, you are required to inform me of what it is. Otherwise, this stop is unlawful. Reynolds' expression darkened. He straightened, hands still resting on his holster. Are you refusing to comply with an officer of the law? Angela kept her voice even. I'm asking for clarification. Am I being detained? Step out of the car. She could feel the tension crackling in the air, thick and suffocating. She wasn't afraid. She had spent years in courtrooms dismantling cases built on racial bias and police misconduct. She knew the law better than he did. But that didn't change the fact that in this moment, on a dark road with no witnesses, the power dynamic wasn't in her favor. She reached for her phone and pressed record. Officer Reynolds, I am Judge Angela Carter of the State Superior Court. You have not informed me of any traffic violation. You are now unlawfully detaining me. Reynolds' smirk disappeared. His lips parted slightly, as if he had misheard her. The arrogance in his posture shifted into something else, hesitation, maybe even fear. He glanced at her license again, this time reading it more carefully. Angela saw it, the exact moment he realized his mistake. She didn't move, didn't break eye contact. But she did allow herself a small, knowing smile. Because now the game had changed. Reynolds' fingers twitched at his side, his confidence cracking for the first time. Angela watched the realization settle in, the subtle shift in his stance, the way his grip on his belt tightened. He had assumed she was just another black woman in a car too expensive for her. He had assumed power was his to wield without question. And now, he was standing face to face with someone who not only knew the law, but had the authority to determine his future. He recovered quickly, masking his hesitation with a scoff. "Judge Carter, huh?" His tone dripped with skepticism, as if daring her to prove it. "That's supposed to mean something to me?" Angela didn't blink. "It means you've overstepped. And it means you're going to regret this stop." A muscle twitched in his jaw. He took a step back but didn't retreat entirely. Instead, he reached for his radio and pressed the button. "Dispatch, I need a unit at my location for backup. Possible uncooperative suspect." Angela's fingers curled around the steering wheel, but she kept her expression neutral. This was how it happened. This was how a routine stop turned into something dangerous. Call in another officer, change the narrative, create a reason to escalate. "Uncooperative?" she repeated, voice steady. "You pulled me over without cause. You refused to tell me why. You demanded I exit my vehicle without justification. I have complied with every lawful request. That makes you the problem, not me." Reynolds didn't like that. His hand hovered near his holster again, not gripping it but close enough to send a message. "I don't take orders from you, lady." Angela tilted her head. "Oh, but you do. The moment you ran my license, you had access to my record. You know exactly who I am." His nostrils flared, but he didn't respond. They stood there, the silence stretching between them, thick with unspoken tension. The sound of an approaching vehicle broke it, headlights washing over them as another squad car pulled up. A younger officer stepped out, face partially obscured by the glare. He moved with less bravado than Reynolds, his hesitation evident as he took in the scene. Reynolds turned toward him. "Got a non-compliant driver here. Gave me some lip when I asked her to step out." The younger officer frowned, eyes shifting from Reynolds to Angela. He took a step closer, peering through the open window at the woman sitting calmly behind the wheel. His brows furrowed. He knew that face. Everyone in the legal system did. "Wait," he muttered, recognition dawning. "Is that Judge Carter?" Angela didn't react, but she noticed the flicker of unease in Reynolds' expression. The younger officer hesitated. Sir, I think." Reynolds cut him off. She was being difficult. Didn't answer my questions, refused to get out of the car. Angela exhaled slowly, then turned to the new arrival. "Officer?" Parker," he supplied quickly. "Officer Parker," she said evenly. "Tell me, do you see any reason for me to step out of my vehicle?" Parker shifted uncomfortably. I wasn't here for the start of the stop, ma'am." "Then let me fill you in," Angela said, voice steady. "I was pulled over without cause. I was not informed of any violation. Officer Reynolds has repeatedly attempted to escalate this encounter despite my full cooperation. My license and registration are valid. There is no legal reason for me to be detained." Parker's face paled. He knew exactly what kind of situation this was turning into, and he didn't want to be part of it. "Sir," he started, turning to Reynolds, "maybe we should just—" Reynolds cut him off again. "You questioning me?" Parker hesitated, then shook his head. "No, sir." Angela leaned back slightly, watching the power dynamics unfold. Parker wasn't a bad cop, just a young one, caught between his own morals and the unspoken rules of loyalty. She had seen it before. Reynolds turned back to her. "Step out of the car." Angela let the silence drag out before she finally spoke. "Are you sure you want to do this?" Reynolds' patience snapped. He reached for the door handle. Before he could touch it, Angela locked the doors with a single tap. Reynolds jerked back slightly, startled. His face twisted in frustration, his authority slipping through his fingers. "You are now attempting to forcibly remove me from my vehicle without cause," Angela said, her voice calm but cold. "And you are being recorded." Reynolds' jaw clenched. "You think that badge makes you untouchable?" "No," she said smoothly. "I think the law does. But if you want to test that theory, by all means, keep digging this hole." Reynolds' face turned red. He looked to Parker, as if expecting support, but the younger officer took a deliberate step back. Angela lifted her phone slightly, making sure the camera caught every angle. "Your backup won't save you, Officer Reynolds. But it might save me." Reynolds' breathing was harsh, nostrils flaring. He was trapped, and he knew it. He had overplayed his hand, and now there were witnesses. Another silence stretched between them, heavier than the last. Then, after a long, tense pause, Reynolds did the only thing he could. He stepped back. Angela didn't move, didn't celebrate. She just watched as he turned on his heel and stalked back to his patrol car, yanking his radio up to his mouth. Parker lingered for a moment, his expression conflicted. Then, with a quiet nod of respect toward Angela, he followed. The tension didn't dissipate, not fully, but the worst had passed. Angela took a steady breath. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Reynolds gripped his radio tighter than necessary, his knuckles white with frustration. The situation had spiraled out of his control, and he knew it. He had expected compliance, submission, the same response he got from others he had pulled over under similar pretenses. But Judge Angela Carter was no ordinary target. She was composed, calculating, and worst of all, untouchable in a way he hadn't anticipated. Angela watched from her car as Reynolds muttered something into his radio. The words were too quiet to catch, but she knew what was happening. He was looking for a way to salvage this, a way to walk away without completely humiliating himself. But there was no easy exit. Not with her recording. Not with Officer Parker now standing awkwardly between them, clearly aware that he had walked into a disaster of Reynolds' making. Parker cleared his throat, hesitant. "Ma'am, if you don't mind, I'd like to confirm a few things before we wrap this up." Angela turned her attention to him. Unlike Reynolds, he wasn't acting out of malice, just uncertainty. "Of course, Officer Parker. What would you like to confirm?" Parker hesitated before speaking again. "You said earlier that Officer Reynolds didn't inform you of any violation. Is that correct?" "That is correct," Angela said evenly. "I asked multiple times. I was given no justification for this stop." Parker turned to Reynolds, his voice careful. "Sir, what was the reason for pulling her over?" Reynolds didn't answer immediately. His lips pressed into a thin line, his jaw flexing. Angela could see the war happening behind his eyes. Admit he had no real reason, or double down on the lie. "She was driving suspiciously," Reynolds said finally. Angela let out a soft, humorless laugh. "Suspiciously?" she repeated. "Tell me, Officer Reynolds, what about my driving was suspicious?" Reynolds' eyes flicked toward the dashcam of his squad car, likely calculating whether it had caught anything he could twist in his favor. When he came up empty, his frustration deepened. "You slowed down when I got behind you," he said finally. Angela raised an eyebrow. "You mean I obeyed the speed limit?" "You hesitated at that last intersection," he added, grasping at straws. Angela sighed. "I slowed at the intersection because there was a pedestrian on the sidewalk. I was ensuring they weren't going to step into the street. That's called defensive driving, Officer Reynolds. It's also called being a responsible citizen." Parker shifted uncomfortably. He knew this was bad. Angela decided it was time to put the final nail in the coffin. She unlocked her phone and tapped the screen. "Would you like to see the footage from my dashcam, Officer Parker?" Reynolds' head snapped toward her. His mouth opened, but no words came out. Parker hesitated, looking between them. He didn't want to be in the middle of this, but he also couldn't ignore the obvious trap Reynolds had set for himself. Slowly, he nodded. "If you don't mind, ma'am." Angela turned the phone so he could see the screen. The footage played back in crisp detail, her car moving at a steady pace, her smooth stop at the intersection, the pedestrian lingering near the curb. There was nothing reckless, nothing erratic, nothing that justified this stop. Parker swallowed. He glanced toward Reynolds, whose face had turned an alarming shade of red. "She's right, sir," Parker said carefully. "There's no probable cause." Reynolds turned on him sharply. "You questioning my judgment?" "No, sir," Parker said quickly. "Just pointing out what's on the footage." Angela watched as the cracks in Reynolds' control widened. He had lost. There was no recovering from this, no justifiable excuse to cover his actions. She let the silence stretch before speaking again. "Officer Reynolds, I would like my documents returned now." Reynolds hesitated, fingers twitching at his side. For a brief moment, Angela wondered if he was going to push further, if his ego would force him into making an even bigger mistake. But finally, he pulled her license and registration from his pocket and thrust them toward her. She took them calmly, placing them back in her purse. Then, she looked up at him once more. "I hope you understand the gravity of what you've done tonight." Reynolds scoffed. "Spare me the lecture." Angela's lips curved into a knowing smile. "Oh, Officer Reynolds, this isn't a lecture. This is a warning." His eyes darkened, but he didn't respond. She didn't break eye contact as she continued. "I will be filing a formal complaint first thing in the morning. The footage from my dashcam, as well as this recording, will be sent to Internal Affairs. You have violated my rights, abused your authority, and attempted to escalate an unlawful stop. And now, you're going to face the consequences." Reynolds clenched his fists. Parker took a careful step back, wisely removing himself from the blast zone. Angela reached for her keys. I suggest you start preparing your statement. With that, she rolled up her window and put her car into drive. As she pulled away, she caught one last glimpse of Reynolds in her rearview mirror. His expression wasn't just anger, it was fear. Good. Because this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Angela drove away with controlled precision, her grip on the wheel steady, her mind already working through the next steps. The night's events had unfolded exactly as she suspected they would. Another abuse of power by an officer who never expected to be held accountable. But Reynolds had made one fatal mistake. He underestimated the woman sitting in that car. She wasn't just another driver he could intimidate. She was a judge, and she knew exactly how to dismantle him. The city skyline came into view as she neared her downtown condo, but her focus remained sharp. She tapped her phone to stop the recording and saved it to multiple locations: her cloud, an encrypted drive, and an email draft. Evidence preservation was key. Reynolds would scramble to cover his tracks, and she wasn't about to give him a chance. As she pulled into the underground garage, her phone buzzed. She checked the screen. It was Malcolm, her closest friend and fellow judge. She answered on speaker as she parked. Tell me you're calling to invite me to brunch. His deep chuckle came through the line. You know I would, but something tells me you've had a long night. You okay? Angela sighed, running a hand through her hair. Define okay. Malcolm's tone shifted. What happened? She grabbed her purse and stepped out of the car, her heels clicking against the concrete. A cop pulled me over for no reason. Tried to intimidate me. It backfired spectacularly. There was a pause. Then, Malcolm swore under his breath. You good? I'm fine. But Reynolds? Not so much. She entered the elevator, pressing the button for her floor. I've got everything recorded. Dashcam footage, phone video, audio, you name it. Internal Affairs is getting a full package first thing in the morning. Malcolm exhaled slowly. Angela, you know how this goes. They protect their own. Angela leaned against the wall of the elevator, her gaze sharp. I know. That's why I'm not just going through IA. I'm calling in every favor I have. Malcolm hummed in approval. Now that's the woman I know. The elevator doors opened to her penthouse, the city lights casting long shadows through the floor-to-ceiling windows. She dropped her keys on the entryway table and kicked off her heels. I need a favor, Mal. Name it. I want you to look into Reynolds for me. Deep dive. Complaints, misconduct reports, anything that stinks. Malcolm didn't hesitate. Consider it done. I'll have something by morning. Angela smiled. I knew I liked you for a reason. They exchanged a few more words before she ended the call and set her phone down. The adrenaline from the stop was still humming in her veins, but beneath it was a deep, simmering anger. She had seen officers like Reynolds before, men who thrived on unchecked power, who wore their badge like a shield against accountability. But not this time. Not with her. She poured herself a glass of water, her mind already assembling the plan. The complaint would be the first step, but it wouldn't be the last. She would go public if she had to. And if Reynolds had a history, which she was betting he did, she'd make sure it came to light. The thought steadied her. She had been in battles before. Courtrooms filled with egos, attorneys who underestimated her, cases designed to break her resolve. But she had never lost sight of the bigger picture. And she wasn't about to start now. Before I go on, I know you are enjoying the story, so I would really appreciate it if you give this video a like, smash the subscribe button down below, and turn on the bell notification to get notified whenever I drop a new video. Alright, let's continue. Meanwhile, across town, Reynolds sat in his squad car, gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles ached. This wasn't supposed to happen. He had thought she was just another nobody, some woman who would stammer and comply, who wouldn't dare challenge him. But now he was looking at the biggest mistake of his career. He had heard Parker mumbling to himself after Judge Carter drove off. We're screwed. And he was right. Reynolds had tried calling his superior, hoping to get ahead of the situation, but the response had been curt. Come in. Now. That wasn't good. He stepped out of the car and walked into the precinct, ignoring the knot twisting in his gut. Maybe he could spin this. Maybe he could convince them that Carter had been aggressive, that she had refused to comply. Maybe. The moment he stepped into the captain's office, he knew he was screwed. Captain Harris sat behind his desk, a file already open in front of him. The lines on his face were deeper than usual, his gaze sharp. He gestured for Reynolds to sit. Reynolds obeyed, but his stomach churned. Do you know what this is? Harris asked, tapping the file. Reynolds swallowed. Sir, this, Harris interrupted, is the complaint Judge Angela Carter is filing against you. And this, he pulled out a tablet and played a video, is the footage from her dashcam. Reynolds watched as the screen showed everything. His approach, his smugness, his blatant disregard for procedure. The moment Carter revealed who she was. The exact second his face dropped in realization. There was no spinning this. Harris let the silence sit before speaking again. Do you have any idea what you've done? Reynolds gritted his teeth. Sir, Save it, Harris snapped. This is a disaster. You pulled over a superior court judge for no reason, escalated the situation, and got yourself caught in 4K. Do you have any idea how bad this looks? Reynolds clenched his fists. She disrespected me. She followed the law. Harris shot back. You didn't. Silence. Harris leaned back, rubbing his temples. You're on leave until further notice. IA is handling this now. Reynolds shot up. Sir, you can't. I can, Harris said coldly. And I am. Get out of my office. Reynolds stormed out, his head spinning. His career was hanging by a thread. And if he didn't do something fast, Angela Carter was going to be the one to cut it. Angela sat at her desk, the early morning sunlight casting a golden hue across the stacks of case files. She had barely slept, but exhaustion took a back seat to determination. Today was the day she set things in motion. She had filed the official complaint with Internal Affairs first thing that morning, attaching the dashcam footage and her own recorded video. She knew how these things typically went. Slow, bureaucratic, designed to drag on until people lost interest. But she wasn't just any complainant. She was a judge, and she had no intention of letting this get buried. Her phone buzzed. Malcolm. Right on time. She answered, putting him on speaker as she skimmed a legal brief. Tell me you have something good. Oh, Angela, Malcolm said, his voice thick with satisfaction. I don't just have something good. I have something explosive. Angela set down the brief. I'm listening. Malcolm didn't waste time. Reynolds has a history, and I mean a bad one. Multiple complaints from Black and Latino drivers for harassment, unlawful stops, excessive force. All conveniently unsubstantiated or quietly dismissed. Angela's grip tightened around her pen. How many complaints? 11. That we know of. Her jaw clenched. That was more than a pattern. It was a deliberate, systemic issue. How has he still got a badge? Malcolm sighed. Because he knows the game. Every complaint was dismissed before it could gain traction. The department classified them as misunderstandings or lack of evidence. Angela exhaled sharply. And I let him skate every time. Exactly, Malcolm said. But this time, they don't get that luxury. You're not just some anonymous citizen. You have power. And your case, it's airtight. Angela drummed her fingers on her desk. Then we take this beyond IA. Malcolm chuckled. I thought you'd say that. She leaned back, her mind already piecing together the strategy. We leak it. Not just my complaint, everything. His history, the pattern, the cover-ups. We force public pressure. You want me to get the press involved? Malcolm asked. Not yet, Angela said. First, we send this to the right people. Civil rights attorneys, watchdog organizations. People who can't be ignored. There was a brief pause before Malcolm spoke again. You really want to go to war with the department? Angela's gaze was cold, steady. I want to go to war with corruption. If Reynolds has gotten away with this for years, how many more officers are just like him? Malcolm whistled low. You're making enemies, Angie. She smiled grimly. I've made worse. Meanwhile, Reynolds sat in his car outside a rundown bar on the outskirts of town, gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles were pale. He had spent the morning pacing his apartment, rage burning a hole in his chest. The captain had humiliated him. IA was breathing down his neck. And Carter? That woman was out for blood. His phone vibrated. He snatched it up. Reynolds, a gruff voice said on the other end. It was Detective Mark Shelby, an old friend who had worked Vice before getting kicked to a desk job. A guy who, like Reynolds, knew how to bend the rules when necessary. You're in deep, Shelby said. No kidding, Reynolds muttered. I heard Carter's not letting this go, Shelby continued. She's making calls. Someone in IA is actually taking it seriously this time. Reynolds slammed his fist against the dashboard. She's trying to destroy me. She's got the evidence to do it, Shelby said. And word is, she's digging into your record. If she gets her hands on everything, you're done. Reynolds' pulse pounded in his ears. Then we stop her. Shelby hesitated. Be careful, man. She's not just some public defender you can intimidate. She's got real power. Reynolds sneered. Then I need to remind her that power isn't everything. There was another pause. Then Shelby's voice lowered. I might have a way to slow her down. Reynolds leaned forward. I'm listening. Angela stepped out of the courthouse later that afternoon, the weight of the day's hearings pressing against her temples. She had spent hours listening to arguments, rendering decisions, and ensuring justice was served. But the real battle, the one that mattered most, was just beginning. As she made her way to her car, a figure stepped into her path. Officer Parker. She stopped, raising an eyebrow. Officer. Parker shifted on his feet, glancing around nervously. Judge Carter, I wanted to talk. Angela crossed her arms. About? Parker hesitated, then lowered his voice. About Reynolds. She studied him carefully. He looked uneasy, but there was something else, something like guilt. What about him? She asked. Parker glanced over his shoulder before speaking. He's not taking this well. And I think he's planning something. Angela's expression didn't change, but a cold awareness settled in her stomach. Planning what? Parker hesitated. I don't know exactly, but he's angry. And he's desperate. Angela nodded slowly. I appreciate the warning, Officer Parker. Parker swallowed hard. Be careful, Judge. He's dangerous when cornered. Angela met his gaze. So am I. Parker looked like he wanted to say more, but instead, he nodded and hurried off. Angela watched him go, her mind already shifting gears. Reynolds wasn't backing down. He was going to fight this. Good. Because she wasn't backing down either. Angela sat in her office, the dim glow of her desk lamp casting shadows across the room. A thick file lay open in front of her. Every documented complaint against Reynolds. Every instance where he had harassed, intimidated, or wrongfully detained a citizen. The more she read, the angrier she became. 11 complaints. 11 times he had walked away without consequences. But this time would be different. She picked up her phone and dialed Malcolm. He answered on the first ring. Tell me you have good news, she said. Oh, I have more than that, Malcolm replied. I have a war chest. Angela leaned forward. Go on. I dug deeper into Reynolds' past, and it turns out he's not just a problem cop, he's a liability. 3 years ago, he was investigated for excessive force in a case involving a teenage boy. The department settled with the family, but the records were sealed. Took some legal maneuvering, but I found the settlement details. Angela's stomach tightened. How much? 250 grand, Malcolm said. Paid out quietly, no press, no disciplinary action. And get this, he wasn't even put on probation. He walked right back onto the streets like nothing happened. Angela closed her eyes briefly, rage simmering beneath her calm exterior. That settlement should have ended his career. Should have, Malcolm agreed. But the department covered for him. Again. They always do. Angela opened her laptop and pulled up her drafted statement. This is bigger than just Reynolds. This is about an entire system that protects bad cops at the expense of the people they serve. Exactly, Malcolm said. And now we have proof. Angela took a deep breath. Time to make this public. Press? Malcolm asked. Angela shook her head. Not yet. First, we send it to the right people. The state's attorney, civil rights organizations, and every law firm that specializes in police misconduct. We need them prepared before this blows up. Malcolm chuckled. Angela Carter, always 10 steps ahead. Angela smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. This isn't just strategy. This is survival. Reynolds isn't going to go down quietly. As soon as she ended the call, she began sending out emails, attaching the files Malcolm had compiled. Every document, every record, every name connected to Reynolds' misconduct. The wheels were in motion. Then, a text appeared on her phone. Unknown number. You need to stop. Angela stared at the screen. A threat. She exhaled slowly and typed back. Come and stop me yourself. The message was read, but there was no reply. She smiled coldly. They were scared. They should be. Across town, Reynolds sat in a dimly lit bar, his fingers gripping a sweating glass of whiskey. Shelby sat across from him, his expression unreadable. You sure about this? Shelby asked. Reynolds took a slow sip before answering. I don't have a choice. Carter is trying to destroy me. Shelby exhaled. She's not just some activist. She's a judge, man. You go after her the wrong way, and it's game over. Reynolds set his glass down hard. It's already game over unless I do something. She's digging into my past, leaking things. I need leverage. Shelby hesitated. And if you don't find any? Reynolds' eyes darkened. Then I make some. Shelby stared at him. That's dangerous. Reynolds leaned forward. You in or not? Shelby hesitated only a moment before nodding. I'll see what I can find. Reynolds smirked. That's what I like to hear. Angela arrived home late, exhaustion finally creeping into her bones. But she wasn't finished. She grabbed a glass of water and sat on her couch, scrolling through her emails. Responses were already coming in. A message from a well-known civil rights lawyer. This is major. Let's talk first thing in the morning. Another from a state investigator. I want to see everything you have. We may be able to open a case. Angela allowed herself a small moment of satisfaction. This was working. Then another message came through. No subject. No sender name. She clicked it open. You don't know who you're messing with. Drop this now. Angela stared at the words, her heartbeat steady. Then she closed the email and deleted it. Because she wasn't stopping. Not now. Not ever. Angela sat at her desk, reviewing the official complaint against Reynolds for the third time that morning. Everything was in place. Witness statements, documented patterns of misconduct, and the sealed settlement Malcolm had uncovered. Now it was about making sure this didn't get buried. Her inbox was filled with responses, civil rights organizations offering support, attorneys willing to take the case pro bono, and even a quiet inquiry from the state attorney's office. The momentum was building, and Reynolds had to know it. Her phone rang. Malcolm. She answered immediately. Tell me it's good news. Depends on how you define good, Malcolm said. I just got word from a contact in IA. Reynolds is panicking. He's trying to get ahead of this. Angela smirked. He can try. It gets worse, Malcolm continued. He's looking for dirt on you. Angela leaned back, unfazed. Let him look. That's not all, Malcolm added. I think he's planning to go after you in court. Angela raised an eyebrow. For what? I don't know yet, but he's desperate. He's throwing around words like misconduct and bias. If he can't discredit the evidence, he'll try to discredit you. Angela exhaled slowly. He's playing a losing game. Maybe, Malcolm said. But be careful. Desperate men do desperate things. Across town, Reynolds paced his apartment, his jaw clenched. He had spent the last 2 days calling in favors, trying to find anything that could be used against Angela Carter. But she was clean, frustratingly so. No scandals, no missteps, no skeletons in her closet. She was the perfect enemy. He slammed his fist against the wall. Shelby was supposed to dig something up, but so far he had nothing. And time was running out. His phone rang. Shelby. Tell me you have something, Reynolds snapped. There was a hesitation. I don't have dirt, but I have an opening. Reynolds narrowed his eyes. Go on. Word is, Carter has a meeting with a state investigator tomorrow morning. If they take this seriously, you're done. Reynolds gritted his teeth. So we stopped the meeting. Shelby hesitated. Careful. This is a judge we're talking about. Reynolds smirked coldly. Then we remind her that judges aren't untouchable. Angela left the courthouse late, the weight of the day pressing against her shoulders. She had spent hours in hearings, her mind only half present as she juggled the growing case against Reynolds in the back of her mind. As she stepped into the parking garage, she noticed something immediately. A car. Dark, tinted windows. Parked just far enough away to look inconspicuous, but she knew better. Angela adjusted her bag and walked calmly toward her car. She didn't let her pace quicken, didn't look over her shoulder. Instead, she reached into her pocket and tapped her phone's screen, activating the audio recording feature. As she reached her car, a voice called out behind her. Judge Carter. She turned slowly. Reynolds. He stood leaning against his car, arms crossed, an unsettling smirk on his face. We need to talk. Angela kept her expression neutral. I don't talk to officers under investigation. Reynolds chuckled. That's cute. But you and I both know this is bigger than just one complaint. Angela tilted her head. It is. Which is why I'm making sure it doesn't get buried. His smirk faltered slightly. You think you're untouchable, don't you? Angela took a step closer, her gaze unwavering. I think I know the law. And I know men like you. You think power makes you immune. But you're wrong. And you're running out of time. Reynolds' jaw tightened. You've made a lot of enemies, Judge. Angela didn't blink. So have you. And mine have a lot more to lose. A long silence stretched between them. Then, Reynolds let out a low chuckle. You really don't scare easy, do you? Angela smiled, but it was cold. Not even a little. Reynolds held her gaze for a beat longer before stepping back. Good luck, Judge. You're gonna need it. Angela watched as he got into his car and drove off, her phone still recording. She exhaled slowly. Reynolds had just made his biggest mistake yet. Angela sat in her office, replaying the recording of Reynolds' veiled threat from the parking garage. Every word, every pause, every smug chuckle, it all told her exactly what she needed to know. He was scared. Desperate. That made him dangerous, but it also made him sloppy. She sent the recording to Malcolm with a short message. This just became direct intimidation. Let's use it. A response came almost immediately. He's giving us everything we need. I'll handle it. Angela leaned back in her chair, tapping her fingers against the desk. Reynolds thought he could shake her, but he didn't understand who he was dealing with. She wasn't just fighting for herself, she was fighting for every person he had victimized. Her office phone rang. This is Judge Carter, she answered. Judge, this is Special Investigator Terry Langley. I understand you filed a complaint regarding Officer Reynolds. I'd like to meet to discuss the case in detail. Angela straightened. Of course. When and where? Tomorrow morning, my office, Langley said. I want to go over everything you have. If your evidence holds up, this could turn into a full-scale investigation. Angela allowed herself a small smile. I'll be there. Reynolds sat in the back of Shelby's car, drumming his fingers against his knee. She's meeting with the investigator tomorrow, Shelby said. If Langley signs off on a full investigation, it's over. Reynolds exhaled sharply. We need to stop it. Shelby shot him a look. How far are you willing to go? Reynolds clenched his jaw. We just need to make sure she doesn't show up to that meeting. Shelby was quiet for a moment. You realize if this backfires, you're not just losing your job, you're going to prison. Reynolds turned to him, his eyes dark. Then make sure it doesn't backfire. Shelby sighed. I know a guy. He does persuasion work. No violence, just enough to make sure she changes her mind. Reynolds smirked. Then make the call. Angela was halfway home when she noticed the car behind her. It wasn't doing anything obvious, no reckless moves, no aggressive behavior, but it had been following her for too many turns to be a coincidence. She kept her expression neutral as she switched lanes. The car followed. A test. She made another turn. It followed. Her pulse remained steady, but her mind was already calculating. She didn't go home. That would be a mistake. Instead, she took a detour, heading toward the police precinct. The car stayed behind her until she reached the front entrance of the station. The moment she pulled into the lot, the vehicle sped off. Angela smirked. Before I go on, I know you are enjoying the story, so I would really appreciate it if you give this video a like, smash the subscribe button down below, and turn on the bell notification to get notified whenever I drop a new video. Alright, let's continue. Cowards. She waited a moment, watching the car disappear down the street. Then she pulled out her phone and called Malcolm. I just got followed, she said. Malcolm swore under his breath. You get a plate? No, but I know exactly what this was, Angela said. Reynolds is trying to scare me. You think he'll escalate? Malcolm asked. Angela's voice was ice. I hope he does. The next morning, Angela arrived at Special Investigator Langley's office with a thick folder of evidence. Langley was a no-nonsense man in his 50s, with sharp eyes and an even sharper mind. He gestured for her to take a seat. Judge Carter, he said, folding his hands on the desk. I've reviewed your complaint. If everything you're alleging is true, this could be one of the most significant misconduct cases we've seen in years. Angela nodded. It's all in here. She slid the folder across the desk. Unlawful stops. Harassment. A sealed excessive force settlement. A pattern of cover-ups. Langley flipped through the pages, his expression unreadable. And now he's tried to intimidate you. Angela placed her phone on the desk and pressed play. Reynolds' voice filled the room. You think you're untouchable, don't you? Langley listened without interruption. When the recording ended, he leaned back. That's damning. Angela met his gaze. So what happens next? Langley exhaled. We launch an official probe. Internal Affairs will be forced to take this seriously, and if we find more evidence, Reynolds won't just lose his badge, he'll face criminal charges. Angela nodded. That's exactly what needs to happen. Langley studied her. You understand this puts you in real danger? Angela didn't hesitate. I can handle it. Langley gave a small, approving nod. Then let's get to work. That evening, Reynolds got a call from Shelby. You're screwed, Shelby said bluntly. Reynolds gritted his teeth. What happened? Carter met with Langley. The investigation is moving forward. IA is reopening old complaints. They're talking about possible charges. Reynolds' grip on the phone tightened. Not happening. Shelby hesitated. Look, man. It's over. You need to think about cutting a deal. Reynolds' vision blurred with rage. You think I'm just going to roll over? Shelby sighed. If you don't, they'll bury you. Reynolds hung up without another word. He wasn't going to let Carter win. And if the system wasn't going to protect him, he'd handle this himself. Angela sat in her living room, the soft hum of the city outside barely registering in her mind. She had just finished reviewing the notes from her meeting with Special Investigator Langley, but her thoughts kept circling back to one thing, Reynolds. He had to know by now that the walls were closing in. His threats, his intimidation tactics, they weren't working, but that didn't mean he was finished. If anything, it meant he was about to get even more reckless. Her phone buzzed. Malcolm. She answered immediately. What's up? We need to talk, Malcolm said. His voice was tense. It's about Reynolds. Angela sat up straighter. What about him? Malcolm hesitated. You're not going to like it. Reynolds parked his car in the alley behind a rundown bar on the outskirts of town. The air was thick with the scent of stale beer and cigarette smoke as he stepped out and approached a waiting figure. The man, stocky mid-40s with cold, dead eyes, leaned against the wall, arms crossed. You Reynolds? The man asked. Reynolds nodded. You the guy? The man smirked. Depends. What exactly do you need handled? Reynolds clenched his jaw. A message. One that can't be ignored. The man studied him. You sure about this? Judges aren't small time. This goes bad. You don't walk away clean. Reynolds' eyes darkened. Just do your job. The man exhaled, then nodded. I'll be in touch. Angela met Malcolm at his office, her stomach already nodding with anticipation. The moment she stepped inside, she could see it in his face. This was bad. He shut the door behind her. I got a tip from one of my sources. Reynolds is making moves. Angela folded her arms. What kind of moves? Malcolm ran a hand over his beard. The kind that don't leave a paper trail. Word is, he's reached out to someone off the books. Angela's blood ran cold. A hit. Malcolm hesitated. Maybe. Or maybe just an intimidation job. Either way, you're the target. Angela exhaled slowly. That desperate already? Malcolm nodded. Desperate men do stupid things. Angela's mind raced. She had known Reynolds was dangerous, but this was another level. If he was truly willing to cross the line into physical violence, she couldn't afford to just wait for the system to handle it. She met Malcolm's gaze. We need to be proactive. He nodded. I was thinking the same thing. Angela took a deep breath. Then let's make sure Reynolds knows exactly what happens when he tries to play dirty. That night, Angela didn't go home. Instead, she went to a secure location Malcolm had set up, a small, private apartment under his firm's name. It was safer than being alone at her house, especially with Reynolds growing bolder by the minute. She sat by the window, watching the empty street below. Her mind wasn't on fear, it was on strategy. Reynolds thought he was above consequences. That was his greatest weakness. He was used to operating in the shadows, knowing the system would protect him. But now, he was walking into a trap of his own making. She picked up her phone and dialed Langley. Judge Carter, he answered. I have reason to believe Reynolds is escalating, she said. Beyond intimidation. Langley was silent for a moment. Then, you have evidence? Not yet. But I have strong reason to believe he's trying to set something up against me. Langley exhaled. I'll put a watch on him. But if you get anything concrete, you call me immediately. Angela's grip on her phone tightened. Trust me. I will. Across town, Reynolds was growing impatient. He sat in his apartment, staring at his phone, waiting for a message from the man he had hired. Nothing. He picked up his whiskey glass and took a slow sip, trying to ignore the sinking feeling in his gut. He had expected Carter to fold by now. Most people did. But she wasn't most people. His phone buzzed. He grabbed it immediately. Unknown number. A single message. Change of plans. We need to talk. Reynolds' stomach twisted. What the hell did that mean? He quickly typed back. What's going on? No response. Reynolds clenched his jaw. He didn't like this. Not one bit. The next morning, Angela arrived at the courthouse as if nothing had changed. But everything had. She had already taken steps to ensure her safety. A discreet security detail was in place. Malcolm was working angles behind the scenes. And Langley had launched a quiet but aggressive probe into Reynolds' recent activities. As she walked toward her chambers, she spotted Reynolds standing near the entrance. Their eyes met. For the first time, she saw something new in him. Fear. Good. Angela didn't break her stride. She walked past him without a second glance, her confidence unwavering. Reynolds had made his move. Now it was her turn. Reynolds gripped his phone so tightly his knuckles turned white. The message from the unknown number had thrown everything off balance. Change of plans. We need to talk. Something had gone wrong. His contact was supposed to handle the job quietly, just enough to make Carter back off. No one was supposed to know. No loose ends. No complications. And yet, here he was, staring at those words, his pulse pounding in his ears. He texted back again. What do you mean? Talk about what? Still no response. Reynolds cursed under his breath and tossed his phone onto the table. He needed to think. If the guy was backing out, fine. He'd find another way. Carter was not going to win. His phone buzzed. Unknown number. He hesitated for half a second before answering. Yeah. A deep, measured voice responded. We have a problem. Reynolds' chest tightened. Explain. The man exhaled slowly, as if weighing his words. Your judge isn't just any judge. She's connected. Someone got wind of our conversation. Reynolds sat up straight. Who? Don't know yet, the man said. But I don't do messy jobs. If eyes are on her, that means eyes are on me. That's bad for business. Reynolds' temper flared. So you're backing out? The man was silent for a moment. Then, I'm out. And if you're smart, so are you. The line went dead. Reynolds slammed his phone onto the table, fury boiling in his veins. This wasn't supposed to happen. Carter was supposed to be cornered, not gaining ground. Someone was helping her. Someone powerful. And that meant he was running out of time. Angela sat in Malcolm's office, sipping her coffee as he scrolled through his laptop. I got a hit, Malcolm said. Your boy Reynolds reached out to someone off the grid. Not a known enforcer, but someone who does persuasion work, if you catch my drift. Angela set her cup down. He tried to hire someone to come after me. Malcolm nodded. Yep. And now that guy's suddenly gone quiet. Angela smirked. Because he figured out I'm not an easy target. Malcolm turned the laptop toward her. Not just that. The guy was being watched. Angela frowned. By who? Malcolm's expression darkened. That's the question, isn't it? Could be Langley. Could be internal affairs. Could be someone higher up who wants Reynolds to crash and burn. Angela leaned back, considering the implications. If Reynolds' hired hand had been spooked, then that meant someone else was pulling strings behind the scenes. And that meant they had an opportunity. She met Malcolm's gaze. I want to push him over the edge. Malcolm raised an eyebrow. Dangerous game. Angela smirked. Reynolds is desperate. If we press him just right, he'll make a mistake. And when he does, we'll be ready. Reynolds paced his apartment, running through every possible scenario. If someone had eyes on him, he needed to get ahead of it. IA was already sniffing around, and if they tied him to an off-the-books intimidation job, it was over. His phone buzzed again. Another unknown number. This time he hesitated. Then reluctantly he answered. What? A distorted voice crackled through the speaker. You really screwed up this time. Reynolds stiffened. Who is this? A chuckle. Low. Mocking. Does it matter? Reynolds' grip on the phone tightened. Say what you have to say. You thought you could make her go away. But you forgot one thing. Reynolds' blood ran cold. What? The voice was almost amused now. Angela Carter doesn't scare. And now, she's hunting you. The line went dead. Reynolds' heart pounded. He stared at the phone, bile rising in his throat. This was bad. Worse than he'd thought. He needed a way out. Now. Angela stood in front of the courthouse, watching the city move around her. She could feel it. The shift. Reynolds had been on the offensive for so long, but now the balance had tipped. She had him cornered. Malcolm had planted just enough rumors to make Reynolds paranoid. Langley had tightened the net around him. And whoever else was in play had rattled him even further. Angela wasn't sure who was working behind the scenes, but for now it didn't matter. All that mattered was the inevitable. Reynolds was going to crack. And when he did, he'd take himself down. Reynolds sat in his car, gripping the steering wheel so hard his fingers ached. His mind raced, but every thought led him to the same conclusion. He was out of options. Someone was moving against him, and it wasn't just Carter. She had power, sure, but this was bigger. Whoever had intercepted his hired muscle, whoever had left that cryptic message on his phone, they had access. Resources. That meant they had leverage. His breathing was shallow as he considered his next move. There was no way to fight this from the outside. He needed protection. The kind that came from flipping the script. With shaking hands, he picked up his phone and dialed a number he never thought he'd call. Internal Affairs. Angela sat in her office, her focus unshaken as she read through the latest update from Langley. Reynolds is spiraling. Word is, he's been making calls, trying to secure a deal. She smirked. The pressure had finally cracked him. Her phone buzzed again. Another message from Malcolm. Be ready. He's about to make a move. Angela set the phone down and leaned back, her confidence unwavering. She had already won. Reynolds stepped into the Internal Affairs office, his stomach twisting. The man across the desk, Detective Joel Bridges, regarded him with quiet scrutiny. You've got 5 minutes, Bridges said. Talk. Reynolds cleared his throat. I have information. About Judge Carter. Bridges raised an eyebrow. Do you? Reynolds nodded. She's been working angles, pulling strings behind the scenes. This isn't just about me. She's using this investigation to settle a personal score. Bridges remained silent for a moment. Then slowly, he reached for a folder on his desk and slid it toward Reynolds. Reynolds frowned. What's this? Read it, Bridges said. Reynolds hesitated, then opened the folder. His blood turned to ice. Inside was a detailed report on him. Every complaint ever filed against him. Every excessive force claim. Every incident that had been quietly buried. And at the very bottom, a single line highlighted in red. Reynolds currently under federal review. Pending charges, obstruction, conspiracy, intimidation of a judicial officer. Reynolds' breath caught in his throat. Bridges folded his hands on the desk. You really thought you were walking in here with leverage? Reynolds swallowed hard. Bridges cut him off. You're done, Reynolds. The only reason you're not in handcuffs right now is because I want to know how deep this goes. Reynolds' mind reeled. He had walked into a trap. He tried to mask his panic. What do you want? Bridges leaned forward. Names. Connections. And if you give me enough, maybe, just maybe, you walk away with a deal. Reynolds' throat was dry. He had spent years bending the system in his favor. Now it was swallowing him whole. Angela's phone buzzed. Malcolm's voice was sharp. Reynolds is in IA custody. She exhaled. That was fast. He walked in on his own. Thought he could spin it, Malcolm said. They already had a file waiting for him. Angela smirked. Poetic, isn't it? Malcolm chuckled. He's got 2 choices now, start talking or take the fall alone. Angela leaned back, satisfaction settling in. Either way, he loses. Reynolds sat in the interrogation room, his leg bouncing with nervous energy. He had spent years thinking he was untouchable. Now, for the first time, he realized what it felt like to be on the other side. No power. No backup. No way out. Bridges returned, dropping another file onto the table. Final offer, he said. Talk now, or we let this play out the hard way. Reynolds clenched his jaw. He had always believed himself to be above the rules. But the game was over. And for the first time in his life, he had lost. Reynolds sat in the cold interrogation room, his hands clasped together so tightly his knuckles turned white. The fluorescent light above him buzzed, casting harsh shadows across his face. He was cornered. He knew it. They knew it. Detective Bridges sat across from him, flipping idly through the thick file labeled with Reynolds' name. The pages inside held every dark secret he had buried, every falsified report, every act of intimidation, every abuse of power swept under the rug. Bridges tapped the file with his finger. You're out of moves. Reynolds forced himself to sit still, even as his pulse thundered in his ears. I want a deal. Bridges smirked. Of course you do. He leaned forward. The problem is, we already have enough to bury you. Reynolds swallowed. You want names? I'll give you names. Just tell me what I need to do. Bridges tilted his head slightly, studying him. And why should I trust anything you say? Reynolds exhaled, trying to steady his voice. Because I know how the game is played. You want a clean house? I can help. Bridges was silent for a moment, then slid a piece of paper across the table. Start writing. Reynolds stared at the blank page. He had spent years protecting the very people he was about to betray. But there was no loyalty in this game. Just survival. And right now, survival meant burning every bridge he had left. Angela sat in her office, the city lights casting long shadows through the window. She had spent years fighting for justice, but this case, this victory was personal. Reynolds had underestimated her. He had tried to break her, to intimidate her, to silence her. Now he was the one begging for a way out. Malcolm entered, his expression unreadable. It's done. Angela turned to him. What did he give up? Malcolm smirked. Enough. Officers, prosecutors, even a few judges who looked the other way for him. IA is already making moves. This is going to be huge. Angela nodded, satisfaction settling deep in her chest. Justice had finally caught up with Reynolds. And this time there was no escape. The next morning, the headlines broke. Corrupt officer turns informant. Massive investigation underway. Angela sat at her desk, sipping her coffee as the news anchor detailed the fallout. Multiple officers under investigation. Cases reopened. Public outrage. Reynolds had been the first domino to fall. And now the whole system was shaking. Her phone buzzed. Langley. She answered. Morning, Agent Langley. His voice was calm, but she could hear the underlying satisfaction. You did it. Angela smiled. No. He did it to himself. Langley chuckled. Either way, the department will never be the same after this. Angela set her coffee down. Good. Because change was long overdue. Reynolds sat in his holding cell, staring at the gray walls. The deal he had struck with Internal Affairs had bought him time. But it hadn't saved him. His career was over. His reputation shattered. The people he had once protected now saw him as a traitor. And the worst part, he had no one to blame but himself. For years, he had used his badge as a shield. He had believed himself untouchable. But Angela Carter had proven him wrong. And now, he was just another disgraced cop waiting for his sentence. Angela stepped into the courtroom, the weight of everything that had happened settling over her. Justice had been served, but the fight wasn't over. There were still others like Reynolds out there, officers who thought the law didn't apply to them. She took her seat at the bench, her gaze steady as she looked at the faces before her. She wasn't just a judge. She was a force of change. And she wasn't going anywhere.